spyware, ads, bad updates, and the like. And while there's been a vocal opposition complaining about these things, the operating system percentages have mostly stayed the same. Linux and macOS might be getting a few more users.
Mint is a popular distribution of Linux. Well, that would be an understatement. It's extremely popular, and with good reason. It's easy to use, everything works out of the box. It's no wonder why people love it so much.
Microsoft has been losing users quietly for years. Complaints about forced updates, privacy erosion, advertising inside the operating system.
Most of the details indicate that the AI experience that everyone is complaining about in 11 is going to be the foundation.
And hardware requirements that locked out perfectly functional machines accumulated steadily without producing the dramatic shift that critics predicted. The percentages moved slowly. Linux gained ground in fractions. The revolution kept not arriving. Then Windows 12 leaked. And what those leaked requirements revealed triggered something different in scale and speed from anything that came before. Not a gradual drift, a mass departure. The largest single migration event in the history of desktop Linux, happening right now before Windows 12 has even officially launched. Start with the number Microsoft quietly stopped saying out loud. 3 years ago, Microsoft routinely cited 1.4 billion active Windows users as a marker of the platform's dominance. That figure has disappeared from official communications. In its place, Microsoft now says it has over a billion users. Over a billion is a number designed to sound large, while concealing a smaller number underneath it. The gap between 1.4 billion and just over 1 billion represents somewhere in the range of 400 million users. That is not organic device retirement. That is not tablets replacing laptops in consumer households. That is a user base that existed, that Microsoft counted, and that is no longer running Windows. The platform was already bleeding before Windows 12 added a new reason to leave. The leaked Windows 12 hardware requirements arrived in February 2026, and the internal documentation made the scope of the problem immediately clear. The processor floor moved to Intel 10th generation, released in 2020, or AMD Ryzen 4000 series, also 2020. That is 2 full generations newer than Windows 11's already restrictive baseline. RAM minimum increased to 16 GB with 8 GB configurations explicitly blocked from installation. Storage requirements set a practical minimum of 256 GB, given that Windows 12's base installation size reaches 67 GB before a single update has been applied. DirectX 12 Ultimate graphics support became mandatory, blocking older GPUs regardless of their functional capability. Display resolution dropped to a minimum of 1080p, excluding 720p hardware entirely. Microsoft's own internal compatibility projections, included in the leaked documentation, estimated that Windows 12 would be compatible with 48% of current Windows 11 devices. Windows 11 had already been compatible with only 48% of Windows 10 machines. Compound those two figures, and Windows 12 is compatible with approximately 23% of the computers that were running Windows 10 when Microsoft's current generation launched. Microsoft is preparing to tell 77% of its Windows 10 user base that their computers are obsolete. The practical translation of those numbers into affected populations is where the abstraction becomes concrete and damaging. Small businesses operating on 2018 and 2019 hardware that runs their accounting software, email, and document workflows without any functional limitation, locked out. Schools that deployed laptops in 2019 for student use and have no budget allocation for replacement cycles that Microsoft did not announce in advance, locked out. Families in developing markets who saved for months to purchase a 2019 desktop and rely on it for work and education, locked out. Government agencies running specialized software on hardware with known good stability, locked out. The replacement cost arithmetic is straightforward and brutal. A small business with 25 computers faces $15,000 to $30,000 in forced hardware expenditure. A school district with 500 machines faces $300,000 to $600,000. None of these are planned capital expenses. They are costs Microsoft is imposing on institutions and individuals who have functional hardware that performs their required tasks without difficulty. The leaked documentation also included internal Microsoft research showing that 68% of Windows users would prefer to disable AI features entirely, if given the choice. Microsoft's response to that finding was not to make AI optional. It was to make AI mandatory and tie it to hardware requirements that force users either to buy new machines capable of running it or to find an alternative platform. The Linux migration data that followed the Windows 12 requirement leaks is unlike anything previously recorded in desktop OS measurement history. StatCounter's global desktop market share data shows Linux at 4.8% in January 2025. By January 2026, that figure had reached 14.2%. That is a 196% increase in 12 months. The acceleration compressed into the final 4 months of that period, in direct correlation with two events: Windows 10 losing mainstream security support in October 2025, and the Windows 12 requirement leaks arriving in November 2025. September 2025 showed Linux at 8.1%. October pushed it to 9.7%. November reached 11.3%. December hit 12.8%. January 2026 landed at 14.2%. Each monthly step upward was larger than the one before it. The curve was not flattening, it was steepening. The download figures from individual Linux distributions confirm what the market share data suggests. Canonical reported 17.3 million Ubuntu downloads in January 2026, compared to 2.1 million in January 2025. That is a 724% year-over-year increase in a single month. Linux Mint reported 8.9 million downloads against 1.4 million the prior year. Fedora recorded 4.2 million against 680,000. Every major distribution was seeing exponential growth simultaneously, which means the surge was not driven by one distribution marketing itself effectively. It was driven by a category of users making a platform decision and then selecting whichever distribution suited their needs. Canonical surveyed 50,000 recent Ubuntu downloaders to understand who was arriving and why. 81% reported switching from Windows. Of that group, 73% cited Windows 11 or Windows 12 hardware requirements, locking them out of their existing machine. 68% mentioned forced updates and loss of system control. 62% identified privacy concerns around Windows data collection. 59% cited the financial burden of Microsoft's hardware requirements. 91% of respondents said their computer that Microsoft had classified as obsolete was working perfectly fine running Linux. That final figure is the one that should concern Microsoft most deeply. The hardware is not failing. Windows is the variable that changes when the experience improves. The user accounts coming out of the migration share a consistency that no coordinated campaign produced. A small business owner in Phoenix moved 12 2018 computers to Ubuntu over a single weekend after Windows 11's TPM requirement blocked installation, and the Windows 12 leaks confirmed the trajectory would only worsen. Email, accounting software running through the browser, LibreOffice for documents. Employees adapted within 2 days. $15,000 in forced hardware replacement costs eliminated. A high school IT director in Seattle managing 2,800 2019 student laptops that Windows 12 would not support, and a replacement budget of $0 migrated the entire fleet to Linux Mint. Students moved to the browser-based tools they were already using. The operating system change was invisible to daily workflow. A software developer in Bangalore whose 2019 ThinkPad Microsoft had designated incompatible switched to Fedora, and found that development tools ran faster natively, battery life extended by 40%, and the machine Microsoft called obsolete became more productive after the switch than it had ever been running Windows. A retiree in Melbourne, whose friend's grandson installed Linux Mint on a 2018 laptop Microsoft said needed replacing, reported that everything required for daily use worked without modification. The common thread across every account is not sacrifice or compromise. It is discovery that the hardware was never the limitation. Microsoft's internal response to the migration data revealed the gap between the severity of what leadership was being told privately and the messaging being produced publicly. A leaked email from a Windows Division vice president dated January 18, 2026, stated that desktop Linux market share had reached 14.2%, up from 4.8% a year earlier, representing a loss of approximately 38 million users to Linux in 12 months, and that if the current trajectory continued, Linux could reach 25 to 30% market share by the end of 2026, representing an existential threat to the Windows consumer business. A separate leaked communication from Windows marketing acknowledged that user perception had solidified around the narrative that Microsoft abandons functional hardware to force expensive upgrade cycles, and recommended reframing Windows 12 requirements around security and performance benefits of modern hardware. The problem with that recommendation was that it had already been tried with Windows 11 and failed. Users had tested Microsoft's claimed justifications by bypassing Windows 11's hardware requirements and installing the operating system on supposedly incompatible machines. Windows 11 ran without meaningful degradation on 7th generation Intel processors and hardware without TPM 2.0. The requirements were not technical necessities, they were arbitrary thresholds. Users documented this extensively and shared the documentation widely. The trust that Microsoft's technical justifications required had already been spent. Satya Nadella addressed the migration directly on Microsoft's February 2026 earnings call, when an analyst asked how the company was responding to desktop Linux reaching 14% market share. Nadella's answer focused on delivering value through AI-powered experiences in Windows 12 and supporting Windows 10 users through extended security updates while they prepared to upgrade. That response missed the question being asked. The users leaving for Linux are not users who need additional time before upgrading. They are users who have evaluated the upgrade path Microsoft is offering and chosen a different platform permanently. Framing their departure as a timing issue rather than a preference decision reflects either a misreading of the survey data Microsoft's own research teams were producing, or a deliberate choice not to acknowledge publicly what internal communications acknowledged privately. The hardware manufacturers who had already been moving toward Linux treated the Windows 12 leaks as confirmation of decisions they had made on earlier evidence. Dell stated publicly that Windows 12's restrictive requirements validated its move to make Linux the default on the majority of its lineup, noting that its Linux systems supported hardware from 2015 onward, and that 7-year-old machines ran current Linux distributions without performance compromise. HP's chief executive made a rare direct public comment characterizing Windows 12's requirements as planned obsolescence presented as innovation, and stating that HP's Linux systems delivered better user experience on older hardware than Windows delivered on new hardware. System76, the Linux-focused manufacturer, reported 340% sales growth in the fourth quarter of 2025 and 280% growth in the first quarter of 2026, with its chief executive attributing the surge directly to users discovering that hardware Microsoft had designated obsolete ran Linux faster than it had ever run Windows. Lenovo noted that Windows 12 confirmed the reasoning behind its own Linux default decision. The OEM ecosystem that Microsoft depended on to ship Windows into the market was publicly distancing itself from Microsoft's platform direction, using Microsoft's own product decisions as the justification. The developer migration data adds the dimension with the longest forward consequence. Stack Overflow survey data tracking professional developer platform preferences showed Windows falling from 53% to 38% over 12 months. Mac reached 34.7%. Linux climbed to 27.1%. Windows was barely ahead of Mac among the community that builds the applications the broader user base depends on, and the trajectory pointed toward parity or reversal within the measurement year. The downstream effect of developer platform migration on application ecosystems runs 3 to 5 years behind the migration itself. Applications being developed today by developers working primarily on Mac and Linux are built for Mac and Linux first. Windows versions arrive later, receive less optimization attention, and increasingly become secondary targets. Major productivity applications have already demonstrated this pattern in their launch sequencing. The application ecosystem advantage that kept Windows dominant for 3 decades begins dissolving from the professional end of the market inward, and the dissolution, once started at sufficient scale, does not reverse. Survey data on migration permanence closes the picture that download numbers and market share statistics open. 94% of users who have switched from Windows to Linux in the current migration wave report that they will not return to Windows. That figure matters because every previous period of Linux growth had shown meaningful return rates as users encountered friction and reverted to familiar territory. The current cohort is not reverting. They found that their hardware works, they found that their workflows transferred. They found that the operating system running underneath stopped being a source of problems. Windows 12 has not launched yet. The migration it is triggering is already the largest in desktop Linux history. When it does launch and 335 million additional computers receive the message that they are incompatible, the scale of what has already been set in motion will expand further. Microsoft is not watching users take a temporary detour. It is watching its consumer platform lose the critical mass that made it the default. And the users who have already left are not coming back.